He was the richest rancher in Montana, but also the loneliest. His wife and daughter gone. His home silent for years. Then, in the middle of a deadly blizzard, a widow appeared at his door, clutching her little boy, half frozen, begging not for charity, but for a chance to work. He let them in, but he didn't trust them. So that night, he pretended to sleep, waiting to see if the woman would steal from him. But what she did instead left him frozen in shock, and it would change his life forever. What happened next is not just a story about survival. It's about storms, betrayal, faith, and the kind of love only God Himself could write. Stay with me, because you won't want to miss how this ends. Cha-Cha Chapter 1. The Blizzard and the Fateful Encounter. The winter of 1887 bore down upon the vast plains of Montana with a merciless grip, the kind of winter that stripped the land of color and breath, leaving only endless sheets of white and the howl of winds that cut sharper than any blade. The small town nearby, with its weathered saloon, boarded-up storefronts, and a single church steeple rising above the snow-drifted roofs, seemed swallowed by the storm. The streets lay empty, the wooden sidewalks groaning under the weight of ice, and chimneys smoked weakly into a sky that was nothing but a shifting sea of gray and white. To live in Montana's wilderness during such a winter was to know hardship, and to survive required either unyielding strength or unshakable stubbornness. At the edge of this snow-buried world stood Harper Ranch, once alive with laughter, but now an island of silence surrounded by frozen emptiness. John Miller, the man who owned this spread of land stretching as far as the eye could see, was known in the county for his wealth. His herds of cattle marked with the JM brand, and the sprawling timber-framed house that anchored the ranch. Yet those who had seen him in recent years rarely spoke of prosperity. They spoke instead of his silence, his solitude, and the shadows that seemed to have settled over his face. John was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame built by years of hard labor, even though he employed men to do much of it now. His face bore the weather of sun and storm alike, angular with a strong jaw dusted by a perpetual growth of dark beard, and a thin scar traced across his cheekbone from a ranch accident in his youth. His hair, once jet black, now carried streaks of iron gray at the temples, prematurely aged by grief. His eyes, a piercing blue, carried the weight of storms inside them. For 3 years earlier, fever had stolen away his wife and his only daughter within the span of a single week. Since then, John had grown quiet, his words measured and rare, his heart barricaded behind walls built not of stone, but of sorrow. Only one companion remained unfaltering by his side: Rex, his loyal German shepherd. The dog was 5 years old, a powerful beast with a sable coat that rippled from tan to black, sharp amber eyes that missed nothing, and ears that perked at the faintest sound. Rex had been trained since puphood to guard the ranch and its herds, but in truth he had become John's shadow, a sentinel not just of the land, but of his master's lonely spirit. Many a night, Rex lay by the hearth while John sat silently in his study, ledger books open but untouched, the dog lifting his head now and then, as though sensing the grief that never left the man's chest. The night of the blizzard, the storm came down from the north like a predator, its winds shrieking through the pine groves and tearing across the open plains. The Harper Ranch house shuddered under the gusts, window panes rattling as though they might crack. John had just set another log on the fire when Rex stirred suddenly, ears pricked, nose twitching. The dog let out a low growl and padded to the door. John frowned, pulling his coat from the rack, and followed. He was not a man easily startled, but years of hardship had sharpened his instincts, and he trusted Rex's senses more than his own. Together they stepped into the biting cold, the wind instantly stealing the breath from John's lungs. The snow swirled like ghosts in the lantern light, and through it came a faint sound, muffled, desperate. He held the lantern higher and strode toward the barn, Rex bounding ahead, barking now. There, huddled against the wooden wall of the barn doors, was the shape of a woman, clutching something small against her chest. As John approached, the figure lifted her head, and the lantern revealed her face. Pale, lips trembling, eyes wide and haunted, yet still fierce in their clarity. This was Sarah Johnson, though John did not yet know her name. She looked to be in her late 20s, tall and slender, though her figure was gaunt from hunger, wrapped in a threadbare coat that had long since lost its warmth. Strands of light brown hair clung in damp curls to her cheeks, and her skin, though fair, was wind-chapped and raw from exposure. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there was a dignity about her, a proud tilt of the chin, a stubbornness that refused to break even in the storm. In her arms she held a boy, no older than 6, wrapped in a wool blanket patched in places, his small face pressed to her shoulder. The boy was Daniel Johnson, her only child. He was a thin, fragile thing, his blonde hair tousled and damp from melted snow, cheeks flushed red from the cold. His wide hazel eyes, half-lidded from exhaustion, blinked at John with innocent confusion. When the dog barked, Daniel stirred but did not cry. Instead, he clung tighter to his mother's coat. There was a kind of quiet bravery in him, a reflection of the woman who held him, though softened by the innocence of childhood. Sarah's lips parted, and her voice came out rough with cold and weariness. "Please," she said, holding her son closer. "We mean no harm. We only seek shelter. I will work, whatever you ask. Only let my boy have a place out of the storm." John's first instinct was suspicion. Strangers on the plains often brought trouble, and a woman alone with a child stirred questions he was not sure he wanted answered. But her words carried no deceit, only exhaustion and a desperate pride. She had not begged for charity, not pleaded for pity. She had offered labor, her dignity intact even in the face of deathly cold. For a moment John said nothing, his lantern casting their shadows across the barn doors, while Rex sniffed at the boy's boots and wagged his tail once, as though passing judgment in their favor. Finally, John let out a breath that steamed in the night air. "Come inside," he said, his voice, deep but steady, betraying neither the unease nor the faint stirrings of something long buried in his chest. He gestured toward the ranch house, the lantern light bobbing as he led the way. Sarah hesitated for only a moment, then gathered Daniel closer and followed, her steps unsteady in the snow. Inside the warmth of the house, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow across the wooden beams. John ushered them in, closing the door against the howling wind, while Rex circled once before lying down near the boy, as if already claiming him under his protection. John studied the woman and her son in the flickering firelight, the haunted pride in her eyes, the child's trembling yet uncomplaining form, and something within him stirred uncomfortably. He did not yet know what to make of them, but he knew one thing. They had crossed his threshold, and with that came responsibility. Still, trust was not a gift John Miller gave easily, not anymore. His heart, scarred by loss, warned him against hope. He decided then that while he would allow the widow and her son a place by his fire, he would also watch them closely. He would learn who they truly were. He would test them, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. For John Miller was a man who had been broken once by fate, and he would not be broken again by misplaced trust. And so, as the storm raged outside and the snow piled against the windows, the first chapter of their fateful crossing began, though none of them yet understood just how deeply their lives were about to change. Chapter 2. The Test in the Night. The storm had not relented. Outside the heavy windows of the ranch house, the wind drove snow against the glass with a fury that seemed bent on burying everything alive. Within, the fire burned low in the study, casting flickers of amber across shelves lined with leather-bound ledgers and the dark portraits of ancestors long gone. John Miller sat slouched in his high-backed chair, his broad shoulders sunk deep into the worn leather. He had loosened his collar and let the shadows of the firelight creep across his face. His eyes were closed, his breathing measured, and to anyone looking, he appeared overcome by fatigue. But in truth, John was not asleep. His mind was sharp, his senses alive, and his hand rested loosely on the arm of the chair while Rex, the German shepherd, lay stretched out near the hearth with his ears alert though his body was still. John had made up his mind. If this woman, Sarah Johnson, and her boy Daniel meant harm, if they were here with motives other than survival, he would know tonight. He had been deceived before by men who wore honest faces until opportunity showed their true nature. He would not be caught unguarded again, not in his own house. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of embers. Then it came, the softest sound of hesitant footsteps on the wooden floor beyond the study door. The handle turned with care, and the door creaked open. A sliver of cold air drifted in, carrying the faint scent of damp wool and lavender soap long faded. Sarah entered, moving carefully, her frame outlined against the faint lantern glow from the hall. She wore the same worn coat she had arrived in, though she had removed her gloves, and her hands, reddened from cold and labor, rested lightly on the small shoulders of her son. Daniel clutched her skirt with one hand, his wool blanket dragging across the floor with the other, his wide hazel eyes staring at the hulking form of John slouched in the chair. Rex lifted his head, ears pricked, but John remained utterly still. Sarah paused for a long moment, studying him as though deciding whether to retreat. Her face, though weary, held a quiet resolve, and she guided Daniel forward until they reached the rug near the hearth. John expected her to glance at the ledgers on his desk or perhaps test the drawers, but she did no such thing. Instead, she sank to her knees, the firelight painting shadows under her cheekbones, and drew her son close. Daniel whispered, his voice thin and innocent. "Mama, is he still sad?" The boy's hair gleamed gold in the glow, and his small mouth quivered with the weight of a child's question. Sarah sighed softly, brushing his hair back with fingers that trembled only slightly. "Yes, darling. He is sad. A different kind of sad than we've known. But it lives in his eyes." John felt his chest constrict, though his face betrayed nothing. His heart had been locked away. Yet here a boy he had known only a few hours spoke aloud, the truth he thought invisible. Daniel's next words pierced even deeper. "But he gave us wood and food. Does that mean he's good?" Sarah's answer came slowly, with thoughtfulness that bore the mark of a woman seasoned by hardship. "Yes, my son. A good man can still carry pain. Goodness does not erase sorrow, just as sorrow does not erase goodness." The boy seemed to consider this with the gravity only children can give simple truths. Then Sarah bowed her head and whispered, "Let us pray." She took Daniel's small hands in hers, and together, in voices soft but steady, they prayed not for wealth, not for escape, but for gratitude. "Dear Lord," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly, "thank you for this roof above us, for the fire that warms us, and for the man who opened his door to strangers. Thank you for keeping my boy alive to see another night." Daniel echoed, his words unsteady but earnest. "Thank you for Mr. Miller." John's throat tightened at the sound of his own name in the boy's prayer. Sarah continued, her voice catching, "Please, Lord, if there is still kindness in this world for him, help him find it. Let him know he is not alone, even when he feels it. Help his heart remember how to feel joy, for he has carried sorrow too long." Rex shifted on the rug, laying his head on his paws, his amber eyes fixed on the boy as though even the dog sensed the sacredness of the moment. Sarah's voice softened further. "And help me, Lord, to earn what we've been given, to never take more than we need. And if the day comes when we must leave, let us go with dignity, not as beggars, but with heads held high." "Amen," Daniel murmured, and Sarah pressed a kiss to his forehead. She rose slowly, gathering her son into her arms, and turned toward the door. Their footsteps retreated into the hall, the study door closing with a faint click. Only then did John open his eyes. The fire had dwindled to glowing coals, and the house creaked softly under the weight of the storm outside. His face was warm from the fire, but his chest burned with something deeper, something he had not felt in years. The woman had not tried to take from him, not sought to deceive. She had prayed for him, a man she had no reason to trust, and in her voice there had been no falsehood, only truth. For the first time since the fever had stolen his family, John Miller did not feel entirely alone. He remained still in his chair, Rex now lifting his head to glance at him, as though asking silently what his master made of all this. John reached down and laid a hand on the dog's head, rough palm meeting warm fur. He said nothing, but the silence that filled the study was no longer the same silence he had known for years. It was something changed, something touched by the presence of a woman and her boy who had crossed his threshold in a storm and carried with them not demands, but prayers. And though he would not admit it, not even to himself, John knew that whatever test he had planned had already begun to turn against him. Chapter 3. The small flame in the cold house. The blizzard passed slowly, leaving the land blanketed in silence. Days in Montana's winter blurred together, each dawn indistinguishable from the last. The horizon swallowed by white plains stretching endlessly until they met the pale sky. Yet inside Harper Ranch, a subtle change had begun, faint as the ember in the hearth but growing stronger with each passing night. John Miller, though he spoke little, noticed every detail. He saw how Sarah Johnson rose before the household stirred, her slender figure wrapped in a faded shawl, her light brown hair gathered hastily into a knot that still left strands loose against her wind-burned cheeks. She moved with quiet purpose, never idle, as though labor itself gave her dignity. Her hands, roughened by years of work, carried no complaint. She scrubbed the wooden floors, patched the linens, and mended Daniel's threadbare socks with the patience of someone who had learned early that life offered no shortcuts. Daniel, for his part, brightened under the warmth of shelter. The boy's hazel eyes lit more often with mischief, and he followed Rex through the halls like a smaller shadow, his laughter carrying down corridors that had not known a child's voice in years. He adored the dog, tugging at Rex's ears and patting his thick sable fur until the German shepherd, usually stoic, tolerated the attention with a kind of solemn acceptance. Rex, ever watchful, had accepted Daniel into his circle of protection, standing guard by the boy at night as he slept on a pallet near his mother's bed. John observed them from a distance. He never voiced it aloud, but he found himself listening for the sounds. Sarah humming softly while preparing meals, Daniel's innocent chatter, the gentle scrape of Sarah tending the fire. They disturbed the silence he had once thought he desired, yet he realized with an unease that he no longer found the silence comforting. Instead, it was her presence, their presence, that kept the cold from sinking too deep into the walls. One evening, after a day spent overseeing the ranch, hands cut paths through drifts of snow to reach the cattle, John returned to the study. The fire had dwindled, and he settled into the chair where he had so often feigned sleep. Exhaustion tugged at him, but he did not close his eyes. Instead, he watched. He saw Sarah slip quietly into the room, carrying a basket of kindling. She bent gracefully, her frame thin but steady, and coaxed the embers back to flame. When the fire caught, she paused, studying his slouched form. Thinking him asleep, she fetched a wool blanket from the rack and carefully draped it over his shoulders. Her fingers brushed his sleeve, light as breath, before she drew back. Then she crouched at his feet, placing a warm stone wrapped in cloth against his boots. "So you do not wake with frozen toes," she whispered, her voice no louder than the crackle of wood. John's heart thudded heavily in his chest, though he remained motionless. For the first time in 3 winters, he felt warmth that came not from fire, but from another's care. Rex lifted his head, amber eyes reflecting the flames, as if silently approving her gesture. Sarah left without another word, her steps fading down the hallway. John exhaled slowly, realizing his fists had curled unconsciously into the arms of the chair. 2 mornings later, while the wind howled outside, Daniel approached John shyly, clutching a piece of paper covered with smudges of charcoal and colored wax. The boy's cheeks were flushed with pride. "I made you something," he said, his small voice eager but uncertain. John took the paper, his rough hands dwarfing it. On the page was a drawing, crude, uneven, but heartfelt. A tall man with a wide-brimmed hat stood beside a barn, a little boy at his side holding hands with him. Beside them, unmistakable with pointed ears and a wagging tail, was Rex. Above, the sun shone bright, and crude flowers dotted the ground. For a long moment, John said nothing. His blue eyes, normally cold as winter skies, softened. Daniel shifted nervously, his hazel eyes darting upward. "Do you like it?" he asked. John's voice came rougher than intended, choked with something unspoken. "Yes, Daniel, very much." A sound startled him then. His own laughter, low and unsteady, but real. It filled the room briefly, startling both boy and dog. Daniel's face split into a grin. "Mama says smiles are like lanterns. They don't chase away the dark, but they help you see where to go." John chuckled again, folding the picture with care as though it were more precious than gold. He placed it on the desk. "Your mother is right." Sarah, watching quietly from the doorway, pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes glistening with something that looked dangerously like hope. But hope is fragile, and life seldom allowed it to rest unchallenged. It was the morning after the storm eased that John entered the kitchen and found Sarah swaying on her feet, her face pale, beads of sweat forming on her brow. She gripped the counter with one hand, the other still stirring a pot of broth. Before he could speak, her knees buckled. The wooden spoon clattered to the floor, and she collapsed with a faint gasp. Daniel cried out, rushing forward, but John was faster. In 2 strides he was at her side, lifting her into his arms. Her body felt light, frighteningly so, and heat radiated from her skin. Her head lolled against his chest, strands of damp hair clinging to her flushed cheeks. "Sarah," he said sharply, his voice breaking through years of restraint. Her lips moved faintly. "Please, don't let Daniel go to the orphan house." The words hit him harder than any blow. John staggered under their weight, his breath catching. For 3 long years, no tears had escaped him. Not when fever took his daughter. Not when he buried his wife in frozen ground. Not when he sat night after night in silence. But now, holding this fragile woman whose pride had refused charity, whose strength had kept her boy alive, he felt the dam within him shatter. Hot tears burned down his face, silent at first, then relentless. He clutched her hand tightly, as though by sheer will he could anchor her to the world. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice raw, "you will not leave him, and I will not let you leave me." His tears fell onto her knuckles as Rex whined softly, pacing at his side. Daniel clung to his mother's shawl, eyes wide with fear, and John reached out, steadying the boy with a firm hand. "She'll be all right, son," he said hoarsely, though the assurance was more prayer than certainty. For the first time in years, John Miller, once the unshakable rancher, once the man whose grief had turned him to stone, allowed himself to break. And in that breaking, a vow was forged. He would not let Sarah or Daniel be torn from his life. Not by fate, not by illness, not by fear. Chapter 4. The Flood and the Truth Revealed. The days that followed Sarah's collapse carried with them both relief and unease. She recovered slowly under John's watchful care, her fever breaking after several days of rest, yet the event had unsettled the household. Daniel rarely left her side, and Rex lingered at the bedroom door, unwilling to stray far. John himself spent long nights sitting silently at the foot of the bed, one hand on the ledger he no longer opened, the other resting near Sarah's, so he might feel her stir if the fever returned. The walls of Harper Ranch seemed warmer now, yet beyond them whispers had begun to grow. The town of Red Willow lay 12 miles south, a modest settlement of wooden storefronts, a post office, a blacksmith's forge, and a saloon where talk traveled faster than the wind. It was here that rumors began to curl like smoke. Everett Parker, a man in his 40s with a sharp jaw, dark mustache waxed into careful points, and eyes that carried the calculating gleam of ambition, was often found at the saloon's corner table. Once a suitor to Sarah before her flight, he had been rejected when she refused his offer of security in exchange for obedience. Spite had fermented in him ever since, and he now spread poison with practiced ease. He whispered that Sarah had ensnared the wealthy John Miller, exploiting his grief to secure her place. That a widow with nothing and a boy to feed had found the richest prize in the county and would cling to it by any means. Others added their voices. Some claimed John had gone soft, bewitched by a desperate woman. Others, remembering Sarah's husband, Franklin Johnson, a miner known for gambling debts, spoke of unpaid bills and barroom brawls. Franklin had been tall, thick-set, with a coarse beard and a temper sharpened by whiskey. He had died in a knife fight over a card table, leaving Sarah with nothing but a son and a trail of men demanding repayment. Desperation had driven her into the storm, clutching Daniel with frost-bitten hands as she fled the men who promised to collect. One evening, as the storm clouds rolled once more over the plains, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. Her light brown hair, still damp from washing, clung in curls around her tired face. Across from her, John leaned forward, the fire casting shadows across his rugged features. The stubble along his jaw deepened by the flicker of light. He had listened without interruption as she told the truth. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she recounted the debts, Franklin's betrayal, his death, and the fear that had followed her like a shadow. When she finished, silence settled heavily between them. John's blue eyes narrowed, not with judgment, but with thought. He reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers. "What you've carried is not shame, Sarah. It is survival. And I'll not have a woman's strength mistaken for deceit." His words, though simple, carried weight, and Sarah bowed her head, her lips trembling with unspoken gratitude. The next morning, the rain began. It came first as a drizzle, tapping at the window panes, then thickened into sheets that blurred the horizon. Within hours, the creek behind the ranch had swollen, its banks spilling over. By nightfall, water surged through the low meadows, and the ranch hands shouted above the roar. John mounted his gelding, rain lashing his face, Rex bounding at his stirrup, mud splashing up his flanks. The south meadow was chaos. 3 young horses had broken loose, their eyes wide with panic, hooves thrashing as the water surged around their legs. The rope fence meant to hold them had snapped, posts tumbling like matchsticks. John dismounted into the knee-deep current, his boots sinking in mud, hands grasping slick rope as he fought to steady the terrified animals. Rex barked furiously, darting back and forth, snapping at the horses' heels to push them toward higher ground. Then, through the storm, John saw movement, a figure stumbling against the torrent. Sarah, skirts soaked and heavy, hair clinging wild to her face, clutched Daniel tightly to her chest. Her eyes locked with his across the flood, gray and fierce even in terror. "You shouldn't be here," John shouted, his voice torn ragged by the wind. "The hill path collapsed," she cried back. "We had no choice but the riverbed." Daniel whimpered, his small face pressed into her shoulder, and John's heart thundered in his chest. The current surged suddenly, ripping at the earth beneath her feet. A fence post, jagged and splintered, flew past like a spear. Sarah slipped, one knee plunging into the water, her arms tightening desperately around her son. John's vision blurred with fear. "Sarah!" he roared, abandoning the rope and lunging forward. With strength born not of muscle but of desperation, she staggered upright again, fighting her way toward him. John reached her just as another surge threatened to drag them under. He seized her arm, pulling both her and Daniel into his embrace. Water poured from their clothes, the boy trembling between them. Rex pressed close, his wet fur bristling, snarling into the storm as if to challenge it itself. They stumbled toward the nearest shelter, a small tool shed still standing against the hillside. John kicked the swollen door open and shoved them inside. The roar of rain dimmed, replaced by the ragged sound of breathing. Sarah sank against the wall, clutching Daniel, her chest heaving. John dropped beside them, his body shaking not from cold, but from the force of emotion tearing through him. He gathered them both into his arms, his face buried in her damp hair. "You and Daniel," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You are my family. Do you hear me? My family." Sarah froze, her eyes wide, Daniel's small hand pressed between them. Rex lay at the door, his body a barrier, fur dripping, a low growl rumbling from his throat. The storm raged on outside, But within that small shed a vow had been spoken, as binding as any oath sworn before altar or law. Chapter 5. Spring and a new beginning winter loosened its grip on Montana slowly, almost grudgingly. The endless white of the plains receded day by day, revealing the dark soil beneath, damp and rich with the promise of growth. By late March, green shoots pierced the earth, and the cottonwoods along the creek stirred with whispers of new leaves. The sky, once an iron curtain of gray, stretched blue and wide, and for the first time in months birds returned, their songs threading the air like delicate ribbons. On Harper Ranch, the thaw brought back the sound of hammers as fences were repaired, cattle driven to fresh pastures, and the land, once silent, began again to hum with life. Inside the great house, change was no less profound. John Miller, once haunted by shadows, now carried himself differently. His shoulders, broad and square, still bore the weight of responsibility, but his blue eyes no longer looked past people as if through glass. There was warmth there now, faint but steady, a light rekindled. He wore his best wool coat that day, freshly brushed, his dark beard trimmed, the deep scar across his cheek softened by the rare curve of a smile. Beside him, Rex, now shedding his thick winter coat, looked leaner, his sable and tan fur gleaming in the spring sunlight. The German shepherd, only 5 years old, already bore the steady confidence of a veteran guardian. His amber eyes watched every movement with calm vigilance, but his tail wagged freely as he paced the gathering. Sarah Johnson, once gaunt and hollow-eyed, now stood tall in a pale blue dress she had stitched from fabric John himself had quietly purchased for her in town. The dress fit her slender frame with simple grace, the color bringing out the clear gray of her eyes. Her light brown hair, usually tied hastily, had been pinned up carefully, loose curls framing her soft face. Though she still carried the lines of hardship in her features, there was now a glow about her, as if spring itself had seeped into her soul. For the first time in years, her steps did not falter with uncertainty. She walked with the bearing of a woman no longer hunted by misfortune, but embraced by hope. Daniel, 6 years old, wore a vest too big for his small frame, the buttons mismatched, his blonde hair combed neatly, though one stubborn cowlick refused to be tamed. In his hand, he clutched a bouquet of wildflowers he had gathered himself that morning, dandelions, daisies, and a few sprigs of budding lilac. His hazel eyes sparkled with pride, and when anyone asked, he puffed his chest and declared that he was not only the ring-bearer, but the best man too. A few others had gathered in quiet attendance. Lydia Moore, the housekeeper who had served John's family for more than 2 decades, stood off to the side. She was a woman in her 50s, stern-faced with steel-gray hair tightly coiled. Her sharp eyes softened for once as she held her hands clasped before her. Though she had not always approved of Sarah, today her expression carried a resigned respect, touched perhaps by affection she would never voice aloud. Thomas Green, the ranch foreman, tall and broad with sun-darkened skin and a thick mustache, also stood present. He was a man of steady work and few words, loyal to John since youth, and his calloused hands were clasped behind his back as he witnessed the vows in quiet solidarity. The ceremony took place beneath a plum tree that John and Sarah had planted together only weeks earlier. Though still young and slender, its branches were already tipped with blossoms, white petals trembling in the soft spring breeze. The tree stood not far from a small hill where, years ago, John had buried his wife Abigail and their daughter. To marry here, near the graves of the past, was both a remembrance and a promise that life, though scarred by loss, could bloom again. There was no preacher from town, no church bell, no grand procession. John had insisted it be simple. They stood hand in hand beneath the plum blossoms, with Daniel between them, Rex circling the edge of the gathering, and the handful of witnesses who mattered most. The breeze carried the scent of damp earth and wildflowers, mingling with the faint perfume of Sarah's hair. John cleared his throat, his deep voice steady though his chest swelled with emotion. "Sarah, I have built barns and fences, counted cattle till my soul went numb, but nothing in my life has meant more than finding you and Daniel. For years I believed my heart was buried. That joy was a thing I'd never feel again. You proved me wrong. Today I promise to keep you safe, to honor the strength you've carried alone for too long, and to walk beside you as family." Sarah's eyes shimmered, her gray gaze fixed on his. Her voice came soft but unwavering. "John, I was left with debts, with fear and with nothing but a child to protect. I thought my life had ended in loss, but you, your kindness, your silence, even your sorrow, reminded me that hope does not die. Today I promise not just to share your burdens, but to give you laughter again, to give Daniel a home, and to keep this house filled with life." Daniel wriggled between them, holding up the wildflowers. "Mama looks like an angel," he whispered loudly enough for all to hear, and laughter rippled gently through the small crowd. Sarah's cheeks flushed, and John bent to press his forehead against hers. The vows were sealed with a kiss, simple and tender, as petals from the plum tree drifted down like snow. Rex barked once, tail wagging, his stance proud as though he too bore witness to the covenant. Daniel cheered, holding the flowers high. Lydia dabbed discreetly at her eyes with the corner of her apron, and Thomas Green gave a rare smile beneath his mustache. When John pulled back, his voice dropped so only Sarah could hear. "It's the first time I've seen your smile belong to the future." Her lips trembled, but her words came, "Sure. And the first time my heart knows where it is safe." They stood together beneath the blossoming tree, John's hand clasping Sarah's, Daniel pressed close between them, Rex leaning at their side. Three souls once broken, now mended by love, courage, and faith. Around them, spring carried its fragrance through the air, promising that the harshest winters could yield to new beginnings. Sometimes, God does not send miracles in flashes of lightning or voices from the heavens. Sometimes, His miracles arrive quietly, in the form of a widow's prayer whispered in the night, in the laughter of a child, or in the faithful loyalty of a dog that never leaves our side. John, Sarah, Daniel, and Rex found healing not through riches or power, but through small acts of kindness, courage in the face of fear, and the belief that broken hearts can bloom again when God breathes life into them. And isn't that true for us today? In our daily lives, we may face storms of our own, loneliness, loss, fear of the future. Yet even in those storms, God plants seeds of hope, reminding us that spring always follows winter. The miracle is not that troubles disappear, but that love, faith, and compassion can carry us through them. May this story remind you that you too are never truly alone. May God bless you and your loved ones with strength, peace, and new beginnings. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these tales of faith, love, and resilience. Together, let us keep the light of hope burning, and may God's grace be with each of you.